Hi, and welcome back to the Hasura Deep Dive series, where we look at some of the Hasura 2.0 features in a little more depth, and we'll kind of see how they help you ship applications faster, how they help you ship more secure applications, and ultimately make your job as a developer easier. So let's have a quick look at the project we left off with. We left off with this project called Colors. And we're going to have a quick preview here inside the data tab, and we'll have a look at what is inside. If we go into the public folder, we have this concept of a colors table, which is a list of individual colors. I think we supported the RGB and the hex values there. So we have green, red, green, blue, supporting those values. And then we have the palettes here, which is sort of a grouping of colors. A palette. And then we had the join table concept here, the palette colors, which allowed us to join those together through a relationship. Now, what we're wanting to look at today is specifically this is new to Hasura 2.0, but the ability to add REST endpoints to a Hasura project, which is a pretty cool feature. And it's really straightforward in how we actually set that up. So let's go ahead and go to the API tab. And we're going to start all of this off right here inside of GraphQL. So I will go ahead and make a very simple query here. And this one is going to simply be to get the colors. You know what, we'll even call this just the all colors one. So worth noting, this is a stored procedure. So this is something that does need to have a name attached to it. And so I'm going to call this the get all colors procedure, if I can spell. There we go. And when I go ahead and formulate my GraphQL query, I'm going to say, so this is get all colors, and then I want to just get the colors themselves, and I'm going to just grab the RGB values like that. We'll go ahead and test this here inside of our interface. And we have an array of our responding colors. We have the green. Had to get my array order sorted in my mind here. And yeah, we have all the values. And in fact, let's go ahead and instead of having to guess, we'll just give the name on that. And we have green, blue, red as the colors returned. Now, let's say that I'm happy with that and I want to persist this with a endpoint that I want to deliver. And why do we even have REST endpoints for GraphQL in the first place? Well, there's a lot of systems out there that don't speak GraphQL. They don't allow you to modify the request. They don't allow you to send a body with a request. In a lot of cases, imagining onboard hardware, or hardware-based network activity, so something where you have to really give it a predefined REST endpoint. There's a lot of cases where REST is still very dominant in the developer world, and with Hasura, you're able to support both paradigms really easily. You're able to say the majority of my developing experience will be powered by GraphQL and the expressive nature of GraphQL. And then for the systems that still need to speak REST, I can support that. So here I have this query, and I'm going to literally just press the REST button. And when I start off with that REST button, I'm going to go ahead and call this the get all colors query here, and you'll see that I have the base path of my REST endpoint here, the colors.hasura.app/API/REST. Now, whatever I put in here will become the suffix of that string, and that becomes my endpoint. So I'm going to call this the get all colors. And you can see that it just fills in there like I would expect. And I'm going to say that I want to support the get option here. Now, because we do have mutation APIs, we do support the entire HTTP verb spec, where you could say, in this case, it makes more sense to have this be a post operation, a put operation, delete. So in reality, I haven't seen patch used too often in an actual project, but I mean, it's part of the spec, so it's supported. But get and post and delete will definitely get you quite far with most cases that you'd come across. Let's go ahead and we'll just use the get for this case. And that allows you to leverage some, browser caching and other benefits that go along with get requests. I'm going to go ahead and say create endpoint. And there we go. It's created. I'm going to go ahead and select this, and we'll test out this endpoint. And we're going to run into an issue. I'll just tell you right away. I'm going to go ahead and go to request bin. And inside of request bin, I'm going to go ahead and just paste this in here. I'm choosing the correct verb, and I'm leaving all authorization empty. I'm going to go ahead and hit send. And we'll see that access is denied because I don't have permission. So we're going to go ahead and hop back over real quick to our application. And the reason why this is access denied is because I have not enabled this API endpoint yet. We're going to modify that real fast here to be able to give us access to our requests. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and hop back out to my project overview. I'm going to just hop out to the one level. We'll see our 2 learning projects there. The shapes project belonging to our 1-minute overviews, which will also be available in links if you prefer the fast version of this talk. And we have the colors API. So I'm going to go inside of the settings here for this one. And I need to add a special environment variable here. And this is one of the ones that we just kind of, when we see them, we recognize them as sort of being magical variables based on the title. And we're going to call this is the Hasura, and this is just help us here for this. The Hasura GraphQL, there we go, anonymous, or not anonymous, unauthorized role. So it's this one right here, this Hasura GraphQL unauthorized role. We're going to give this the name for the user that is able to make requests for this content that is unauthorized. So I'm going to go ahead and call this the anonymous role here. I'm going to go ahead and hit add. And now not simply, but now what is happening is it's regenerating the project for me. Not the whole project, but updating the specific settings. I'm going to go ahead and hop back over to the console. I'm just going to close this tab, hop back over here. I'm going to refresh just to make sure that I don't run into any potential hiccups. And I'm going to go over to my data tab now and work on my access controls. Now, this is not a very complex procedure, but it is something you'll want to have well thought out about what your access control patterns are. In my case, I'm going to let the colors be wide open. And so I will go to the permissions tab here, and I'm going to go ahead and type this in for the first time. I'll have to do it once. Make sure, hopefully I misspell things consistently in my project. And I'm going to say that in this case, I will allow this to only be select operations on the data. And with that, I will go ahead and say without any checks, there's no restrictions or anything else. We'll cover access controls in a different video. And I will say, you know what, go ahead and give permission to all of these columns. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and say save permissions. I think I'm making sure I got everything correct. I did. All right. So we'll go ahead and save permissions. And now I have on the select field the ability to view that. What that will now enable is when I come back over here, because I'm not actually passing in any headers, that will be inheriting now, because of the environment variable, the default anonymous role, and allow me to make requests without any kind of special requests, any kind of special headers being passed in. Long way around to say, that opens up our API for us to access this data. And so now we can see that this one REST endpoint is able to request our data, which is actually really quite interesting. And that's basically all that we have there. We're able to say we have this endpoint that is going to go out and execute this function on the server. That's powerful because that gives us protected code execution inside of the Hasura cloud environment. That allows us to, especially in terms of Jamstack, there's a lot of cases now where this is going to be a really big opener for a lot of people, because you're able to say, I don't need a specific server to be handling my processing of sensitive data. I can just scope down and say, limit this to only the first 5 results or some kind of pre-filtered response. It's a very powerful primitive that will give you access to some very interesting building concepts. So hopping over into the graphical editor now, let's look at some more advanced features of the REST endpoint control. So I'm going to hop over here, and we're going to enable a dynamic variable input here. So I'm going to say that I want to limit this by, let's say, the first 2 colors, for example. Let's go ahead and just test that, make sure it works. Great. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually convert this into some variables. So we'll go ahead and say that on that get all colors, that's going to take in input arguments, and we're going to say that this is the limit, and that needs to take in an integer. And that limit, it's saying, hey, you're not using me yet, so that's fine. We're going to go ahead and move this into the limit category here. Great, and it's saying unknown type. Number. Int. There we go. So now I need to pass in the variable here to go ahead and test this. We'll go ahead and say that the limit is going to be now 2. Let's run that. That works. Limit is now 1. Great, that works. So we're going to take this now, and we're going to make a new endpoint that takes in the dynamic arguments, which is going to be interesting to have a look here. So we'll move in now to our REST endpoint. We'll go ahead and create REST. And from here, we have our new limit here. We're going to make this as a GET request here. And from there, what we need to do is we're going to say get some colors. And now I'm going to go ahead and put a dynamic URL segment in here. And I'm going to just call this limit for now. And we'll see here, it says that this is the location of your endpoint, must be unique. Any parameterized variables, for example, the colon ID, will be made available to your request. So this colon limit will now be the variable that I'm passing in to associate or to match up with the limit argument that I've created. So we're gonna call this the get some colors. And I will go ahead and say that that is fine. So we'll go ahead and hit create endpoint. And now when we do that, we'll go back to testing on the request bin here. So I'm going to switch now to the get some colors. And I will go ahead and pass in just a 1 there. And we get our filter on the arguments. So the dynamic URL segments are very helpful, and I find that as one of the really powerful features that we've enabled with this functionality. Let's look at creating mutations now. So I'm going to go ahead and move back over to the graphical interface, and I'm going to do a new mutation now. And I'm going to actually call this the create, and we're going to go ahead and use hex colors now. So I'm going to go ahead and say create hex color, and I'm going to take in a string argument now. We'll call this just simply the hex, and we'll call this obviously a string. This will be a required input, and I'm going to use this here. That will argue at me actually because it's not required in the mutation itself. So we're going to go ahead and also take in a name. Let's do this. So we're going to actually take 2 inputs, and I'm going to say we have a name here. And we're going to go ahead and call this also a string, obviously. This is a required input. And now on our mutation, we're going to go ahead and say insert colors. Insert colors 1. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. And we need to go ahead and pass in now our object. Let's go ahead and move that down just so I can see. There we go. Insert colors 1 object, and we're going to do the name is going to be our name, obviously, and then the hex, not the variable yet. There we go. Thank you for the auto help. Hex, great, and we will just inspect that response now with the name and the hex value coming back. What we'll also add here is a constraint behavior. So we'll say is on conflict. What we're going to do is we'll say that the constraint here is going to be on the name, colors name key, and we'll just tell it that we want to update the column for the actual hex value. So that way we could potentially overwrite this behavior. Now we're going to have to modify our permissions on this as well later on so that we can say that we're allowed to do mutations with no authorization. Let's remove our variable here, which is a bad idea for production. Don't do what I'm about to do. But we'll go ahead and we'll persist this one here to our system. Now I'm going to go ahead and test this out now. I want to go ahead and pass in a name. And we're going to call this one cool green. And I'm going to unfortunately have to reference the only hex name that I know by heart, which is a very immature string that just happens to be the only thing that's really ever stuck with me over the years. So that is our color here that we're gonna work with, except for I think with the white and the black colors. But we'll go ahead and we'll run this mutation. And we've got our cool color here, our cool green. And if we go ahead and reset this to a 0, 0, 0, I was just trying to count, but this is a string and it's not actually parsing the colors correctly, so I'm not going to count. And we'll see that we've overwritten the actual cool green color. If we go back to our data here, just to confirm that underneath colors, we'll see that we have just the one cool green is overwritten here. So we're going to go back to the API. We're going to take this and we're going to persist this now as a REST mutation. And there's a number of ways we could do this. We could either make this a post request where it will then take the body and it will go ahead and parse that as the input, or we can also parameterize the URL for a similar effect, which is a format that I tend to personally like, and I'm going to go ahead and use that in this case. I'm going to say that this is the create hex endpoint. And I'm going to go ahead and call this, let's go and be consistent with our naming here. So we'll call this create hex color. And on the location, what we're going to do is we'll call this the create hex color, parameterize the name, parameterize the actual hex value. So we're going to go ahead and give this like that. We'll go ahead and say create this endpoint. And now what we have here is the create hex color, and we have the name and the hex as our rather structured input. So let's go ahead and test this one. And I will go ahead and just take that whole string, and we'll go over here. Remember, we switched this now to a post, and I need to go back over here and open up my permissions on that. So let's do that real quick. So on the colors, we're going to go ahead and modify our permissions tab there to say that the insert needs to also be without any checks for the anonymous role. Again, don't do this in production. This is not a good idea unless you have a very, very compelling case for this. We'll go ahead and say that we will allow this to be just totally open actually, and we'll save that permission. And then we will go ahead and do the same for update because we have that conflict handler. So we'll go ahead and we'll say without any checks, and we'll update that again for everything. So again, really bad idea. Don't do this in production, but for the sake of learning, this will save us some time. All right, now we have everything created as needed here. Let's let that kind of run through an update. And now we will go back to the Explorer here, and we're going to go ahead and use that new create hex color. Again, the name we need to pass in here, we'll call this the cool, that's parameterized URL. I'm not going to bother with that right now. So I'm going to go ahead and just simply call this slick, because that's the only word that's coming to my mind right now. And we will pass in this other utility. Now it's already falling apart on me because I would need to actually URL parse this thing here. So I'm going to go ahead and just say we're just going to do it like that to prove the case. Otherwise, you would have to do a lot of parsing of your strings that you're passing in URL format. And I'm not going to worry about that. So we're going to go ahead and do post for right now, and we'll go ahead and hit send. And we see that we've written our color to the system. We'll go to the REST endpoint. We're going to take this, the hex color one that we have. We're going to go ahead and go back to the GraphQL Explorer. We're going to go ahead and repersist this one. And in this case, we'll call this the create hex with body. That will need to be a post. We'll go ahead and we'll say create hex with body is the name of our endpoint. And I'm going to go ahead and simply create that. And now with that created, if we go back to our testing tool and we go ahead and update our endpoint, was the whole thing that I copied? No, just that, good. All right, we'll go ahead and take this, passing in the name and the hex, and now we'll go ahead and hit send. And we can see that our response here is the test color with the inserted color. That's long enough for this video. Hopefully you see a lot of the power behind the REST endpoints and what it can possibly enable and expose for your system, how you build, if you're going to be doing on-device development, if you're going to be doing any number of touching any number of systems that still require a REST endpoint, external clients, WYSIWYG builders, any number of things where REST is still a fairly dominant player. This will be a very helpful way to allow you to both currently embrace the benefits of GraphQL right away in your new projects, while still maintaining and supporting the projects that have not yet enabled GraphQL, or in cases where GraphQL is just not a great use case, but you still want to be able to have both of those supported in your backend. That's it for this video. Hopefully that covered the REST endpoints thoroughly enough for you, and we will see you in the next deep dive video.